Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 7th of December 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thomson, bringing us Eastern approaches from the Netherlands.
We're going to kick off with Brexit because, of course, all the UK negotiators, or at least some of them, have gone to Brussels for the UK-EU negotiations, continuation of. Barnier left London on Friday and is back in Brussels, as are, David Frost, as you can see on screen there, was arriving at Brussels Airport for this event, if we can call it an event. Now, the question is, why is this going on? And Brian, I think, and Alex, I'm not certain that everybody really is quite familiar with why this is going on, because everybody, or at least most people, have been told that Brexit is over, that we have left the country and so on, or left the EU and so on. I do apologise, my mic is off, so I'm just going to fix that. Just give me 1 second, if I can do that quickly. Apologise for this. There we go. So that should be on again now. So I apologise for that. So why is this negotiation happening at all? Because we were supposed to have left in December. Well, the truth is, of course, that was only part of the Brexit process. What happened was that we had a divorce. And now we're having a remarriage of some kind, that remarriage, that future relationship is still, that deal is still to be done. Now, if you're looking at the mainstream press, what will you see? You'll see mainly that it's about trade, but of course it goes much beyond that. So let's just remind ourselves what the framework is for this negotiation. There is an economic partnership on the left-hand side of this graphic. This is the EU's graphic, of course, not the UK's. But nonetheless, this is the framework that's being used for the negotiations. Everything that we'll see in the press is about a level playing field on trade. It's about fisheries, and particularly fisheries being the so-called sticking point at the moment. But trade in goods, customs, services and investment, and of course the Northern Irish border is included in that as well. But this is only a very small part, or at least half at most, of what is actually being negotiated. And it did amuse me, Brian, that in the BBC coverage of this on the BBC website this morning, they said that trade and other matters are being discussed without ever defining what the other matters are.
Well, of course, they're very frightened of talking about the ongoing EU Defence Union.
Indeed,
BBC
which of
is
course
not going to mention that at all.
Is what this side is all about, the security partnership, which isn't just about foreign security and defence policy. That's a large part of it. It includes sanctions, it includes police and judicial cooperation, it includes data exchange, cooperation between law enforcement authorities, anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing, intelligence exchanges, defence capabilities, space development, and so on. So there's quite a lot beyond the trade deal that's being negotiated here. And look, I'm just going to remind everybody that if you think back to when David Cameron was Prime Minister and he announced the referendum in 2016, well, the first half of that year, he toured around the European Union and met all the various European Union heads of state and ended up with this document here called The Best of Both Worlds. This was published in the UK as a white paper, but what was made very clear in that white paper was that it was a legally binding agreement. It said, well, in the introduction, it said this: we've secured a new settlement to give the United Kingdom special status in the European Union, and went on to talk about things like how it was going to make sure that there were restrictions on migration, that people coming to the country can no longer take out before putting something in, and that they've secured vital protections for the economy, never joining the Eurozone, and all this kind of stuff. Now, it's quite ironic, that really, in a sense, because of course the French never allowed anybody to take out before they'd put in. That was very much a British government thing, that we should be allowed to that people coming into the country should be allowed to take out of the system before they put in. But nonetheless, Alex, I'm going to be fascinated to see, and I've no doubt that there will be a deal done here, because there's too much at stake for there not to be, particularly on the defence and intelligence and policing side. I'd be very surprised if there isn't a deal done here. And I'd also be surprised if that deal doesn't look quite similar to the deal that was done in 2016.
When you're on the continent, Mike, what you notice is that every nation's equivalent of the Home Office, so the Department of the Interior or Internal Affairs, the Department of Security in some EU member states, as it's called, is absolutely determined to have full intelligence on everyone on their territory and passing through their territory. And without exception, they and the British Home Office too, for their part, regard it as a given that they must have full access to each other's increasingly tyrannical databases of DNA identification, travel records, banking records. The US is not the only big bully in the world of banking and sanctions anymore. And of course, the whole gamut of facial recognition tools, in which Britain is in fact in the lead. And you can see this vector developing in the run-up to that early 2016 big unveil of Cameron's, because of course before that you had Theresa May in her long tenure at the Home Office, which increasingly I'm persuaded is the key ministry here driving this ongoing security partnership. The Home Office and the Ministry of Defence more than the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is. And at that point, Mrs. May was quite determined that after Britain had opted out of the entire so-called pillar, the new pillar of the EU that had come in with the Treaty of Amsterdam and Nice of judicial and security cooperation, she brought Britain back into well over 100 measures, including most notoriously the European arrest warrant. Britain's not unique here. Off EU jurisdictions in close cooperation with the EU, such as Norway and Iceland, have voluntarily entered into the European arrest warrant. What binds together each country, I think, in geographical Europe now, whether or not they're in the EU, is that they share this assumption that total information awareness on their, well, not even citizens, but people on their territories and passing through some part of Europe is absolutely to be shared. So there's no governmental interest in ditching that.
Well, I think we just remind people as well on that, Alex, that we've got 77 Brigade of the British Army openly boasting of its work at the moment to spy on anybody who disagrees with HM government's COVID policy, and that information is going to be shared as well. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
No, it's part of the paradigm of the whole flabby establishment that has grown up around, between, above, below governments, elected and appointed governments, the classic three branches. In the putty space in between these, the glue, if you like, there is the world of the non-governmental organization, the lobby group. These are by nature transnational, corporatist, pseudo-fascist, fascistoid, as they say on the continent. They're not interested in borders, they're interested in where people are. They see money and energy, they don't see national adherence. So this is the thinking, the technocratic thinking, which is gaining dominance. I mean, it's something that's no longer uttered in dark corners. James Dellingpole is having the world expert on technocracy come in and discuss the 80-year prior history of it now. So people who have recently defected from the mainstream media have actually taken this on board. There is no alternative discourse being offered anywhere in government, in the classic sense, in the ministries, in the parliaments. There is no dissent to this system.
That is extremely true.
A worrying, extremely worrying situation.
Okay, let's move on from that then, and back onto the issue of vaccines. This is Leeds Live this morning. I think this whole furore over vaccine cards was started by the Daily Mail. But this is being described as an official photograph from the NHS. And the headline in Leeds Live here is the COVID-19 vaccine card every single person in the UK will be given to prove you've had it. And it's being suggested that this is going to be some kind of embryonic immunity passport sort of thing. People on social media absolutely complaining that it's totally forgeable. There's been no problem in producing one of these for yourselves. There's no photograph on it. But in fact, what is it? Well, it's a record of the vaccine that you've had. It has a place there for the batch number. It has a place for the date that the vaccine was given and for the 2 doses of the vaccine. So it looks to me more like something for making sure that if there's any kind of adverse reaction, that they have a record of which that you carry on your person, that because it says in bold text there, make sure you keep this record card in your purse or wallet. so that if you have an adverse reaction in the future, that it's understood which batch that came from and very quickly, and what date you'd received the vaccine in the first place.
I'm sure you're right on that, Mike, but of course this is a thin end of the wedge psychological operation. The moment these cards are pushed out and some people are carrying these cards, that gives restaurants or pubs or other venues effectively the right to ask for them, or to ask if you have one. So I see this as the thin end of the wedge of selling a more formalised medical passport. This is given out in a cardboard form to make people think that, oh well, this is just a sort of temporary measure.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say that, because that's exactly what Nadhim Zahawi, with the health minister, has said. I think you'll probably find that restaurants and bars and cinemas and other venues, sports venues, will probably want proof of vaccination.
Right, so this is making up the law as you go along.
Well, it's making up the law as you go along. It's also, the article was also about softening people up to the idea, because people still don't quite realise that this is the direction of travel. So these official images are showing the cards that patients are going to be covering. It's not clear if the cards will be mandatory to carry, but they'll be handed out in every case, said the Mail. And in large bold font on the front, it warns those with one to make sure you keep this record card in your purse or wallet. So people complaining about it. That's what Nadhim Zahawi had to say about it. He also, sorry.
Could we just ask Alex's opinion? Should we be trusting Nadhim Zahawi and his opinion on this, Alex?
I'm not aware that he has any background in health or associated scholarship. I have to tread very carefully, but I think that the late Gordon Bowden was one of many who looked into Mr. Zahawi and didn't like what they found. Let's just leave it at that. I mean, the whole idea of a cardboard ID card, it's so quintessentially British. Sorry, I don't mean any arrogance here as an emigre, but the Continentals continually say this, and they have good reason to do so. You Brits are so hypocritical. You know, they have on the continent a population register. You are a number. You are a barcode. You have to present your papers, please. It's a high-tech chipped ID document. In Britain, we have to pretend. If people go to ukcolumn.org/constitution and look up the text accompanying episode 3 of our new podcast series on the Constitution, and then click on the word asserted in that, they will find the description of a 1950 case, Wilcock versus Muckle, which was precisely this in a previous guise. It was Britain saying you must carry these cheap, temporary looking cardboard ID cards because of the war, don't you know? And that dragged on for a few years. And then it took Mr. Wilcock saying he was a classic liberal to defy a policeman. And very similar, actually, to what's gone on with Piers Corbyn, because the magistrates didn't dare say we uphold his case, but they did give him an absolute discharge without actually technically declaring him innocent of the charge of failing to supply ID. So this is repeating itself. I mean, the previous iteration was a trial in Greater Manchester, wasn't it, where under the early Blair government, people in Greater Manchester were being told they were guinea pigs for a not quite but sort of compulsory ID scheme, and more latterly the same thing's happening in Merseyside. So these things repeat themselves in Britain. We don't seem to have learned a lesson yet. We're not more liberal than the continental countries. We're just better at disguising the tricks.
Yes, well, that's a good point. Yeah. Now, let's come on to this then. Now, this is from Polish media. It's interesting that I didn't see any coverage of this in English-speaking media, but since nobody will be able to read or at least very few of our viewers will be able to read the headline on that, let's do a quick translation. Coronavirus vaccine. There are doubts. Switzerland has not approved. So what is this saying? Switzerland has not approved the use of coronavirus vaccines from Pfizer, AstraZeneca and Moderna. The Federal Office of Public Health noted that the information provided by the manufacturers lacked data on safety, efficacy and quality. The Swiss want to analyse data from vaccine research more closely rather than rely on conclusions presented to them by the pharmaceutical companies. And Klaus Bolt, who is head of authorization at Swissmedic, said we lack data on the effectiveness of clinical trials and the important subgroups that participated in this large study. So I think that's got to be seen as a piece of positive news, Brian, in the sense that at least one country in the world is saying no at this point in time. And really, that's what every country in the world should have been saying until there were really independent tests of these vaccines done. Alex, it staggers me that we're going to be talking about the MHRA a little bit later once again and their independence. But this is vaccine companies have simply run some tests for themselves. They've said for themselves this is safe, and there's been a rubber stamp exercise gone on in the UK and the United States and other places.
Here again, I know it's not the only angle to grind, but it's the one where perhaps I add a bit more insight than in other areas. The difference between the English-speaking world and the deeper you get into the European continent, two different approaches to health. And actually, in the socialized medicine model of Europe, the Bismarckian healthcare model, especially in Switzerland, which has got traits of the French and the German system, really, people are extremely keen to research for themselves. We might get into this a little later with regard to the high degree of skepticism about the coronavirus vaccines now evident in opinion polls of the French. But the Swiss, especially their laboratory testing, are notoriously independent. They don't get the swing or the pressure, or they don't cave into it at least, that you get with pharmaceutical lobbies in countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia. No, there is actually some rigor to the process, and Swiss laboratories to this day, they can be nobbled, but they have a long history of actually saying, I cannot in good conscience to find this a safe product, more than in other countries. And of course, Switzerland is at least in the first line of defence, as it were, outside the EU system and the NATO system and to some extent the UN system. So it's a little safer in Switzerland for laboratory people to stick their neck out.
Well, yes, indeed. Now, the less good news, of course, is that Switzerland, despite taking this stand on it, I mean, at the end of the day, the vaccine companies don't care, because Switzerland has placed orders for several million doses of the various vaccines. And so those companies are getting the money either way. So from their point of view, it doesn't really matter. But Alex, you were mentioning the French and, well, opinion polls not working out too good or too well for the vaccines.
So on the left, just one of the sources repeating, it was the Journal du Dimanche, I think, that covered it first, but ladépêche.fr is doing a write-up of this, reporting that the majority now, by a slight degree in France, is opposed to the vaccinations being offered, and there's a write-up in English of that on the right-hand side of the page, The Connection, COVID anti-vax sentiment rises above 50% in France. Of course, there's no differentiation here in the rather controlled French press and the Anglophone coverage that spins off of that. In most particularly, there is just deploring of these anti-vaxxers and no details on the fact that the French, German, Swiss populations are much more likely than English-speaking ones to say, well, I'm not opposed to inoculation in principle. I will have classic inoculations for myself and my children, whether they're obligatory or not, but I don't want any messenger RNA editing vaccines, such as the Pfizer vaccine. And the other conundrum, of course, as you say, Mike, is that many of the pharmaceuticals that make a killing literally and metaphorically out of the English-speaking world are Swiss headquartered, although, of course, the ownership is often British-based. And in the next slide here, we have a zoom in to the poll data as covered by one of these French write-ups, La Dépêche. And you can see that France, but also French-speaking countries in West Africa, Togo and Ghana, are right up in the lead. In saying, I don't like this current vaccine. This is data, of course, from the Wellcome Trust, rather suspiciously described in the top banner line there of the French newspaper as a health NGO. Well, it's a bit more than that. It's kind of an arm of the British government these days. But Russia also sceptical. What I draw out of this is that it's by language area that people are in the French-speaking countries in the lead. There is very few economic ties or similarities, I should say, between French West Africa and France. But it's France, Switzerland, Belgium, and the African countries that speak French that are in the lead in skepticism, because there's simply a great deal more honest and complete information available in books and journals in French than there is in English.
Well, it's interesting there, because they seem to have the UK somewhere in the 5 to 10% range. But actually on Andrew Marr's programme on the BBC yesterday morning, he was acknowledging that in the UK, and he was in fact doing more than acknowledging it, he was expressing pretty deep concern that in the UK it's around the 35% mark. So I just wonder, Alex, how accurate that is. I suspect they're understating the situation.
Quite possibly they are understating it. I think I just said Ghana by mistake. It's Togo and Gabon which are out there along with France, above a quarter of people saying I'm not interested in this particular vaccine. And these are within the French-speaking world, Togo and Gabon are regarded as well-educated examples of French-speaking countries. So it does seem to correlate more with people looking into things for themselves. And again, I'm really not knocking Britain today, but I have to say some of these things. There is a tendency for people, many of whom are known to me, to conclude that, in particular, mRNA editing novel vaccines are not tried and tested, yet they will not say so in public. What's different about the continent, particularly France, is that people will just come out and say it. I'm not interested.
Yes, okay, well that's good. Right, well let's just quickly move on then, because of course the plans for the vaccine delivery have been announced. And first of all, we're going to have residents of care homes and their carers. That's the first batch, and that begins tomorrow apparently. Then that's going to be followed by everybody aged over 80 and plus frontline health and social care workers.
Can I just sort of interject there, Mike? Of course, residents of care homes and their carers, they are immensely vulnerable to what the government wants to do because nobody can protect them. Nobody can interface properly with people who are residents in care homes. Their families can't interact with them properly.
I was just going to say that's absolutely right, and we're going to see a little bit of video later on that demonstrates that, indeed, that point. Did you want to say anything?
No, that was just the main bit. I find it very interesting that the government is targeting a group of people that the government itself has made, we'll call it doubly vulnerable. They're vulnerable by means of their age and possibly their physical condition, but now you've broken the protection of the families. So I see this group almost as I'm going to use the word, as a group to be culled. This is what the government is about here.
Okay, now then third on the list is everybody aged 75. Fourth on the list is everybody aged 70 and over, plus those considered to be clinically vulnerable. Then comes everybody over 65. Then everybody between 16 and 64 that has an underlying health condition. That's the sixth group. The seventh group is everybody aged over 60. Seventh group. The eighth group is everybody aged over 55, and the ninth group, everybody aged over 50. And according to the sort of timescales that the government is talking about, we get to group 9 by sort of February, March time, perhaps.
Right, but you've also done something else, Mike, which is now you are dividing the population of the country into these arbitrary groups, and this is effectively saying that if you're 50 years old or older, you have now become quasi-vulnerable because you are on this list. So just by the fact that somebody gets to the age of 50, the government says, we've got to pay special attention to your health and well-being because you're over 50.
Well, that's true, that there is that. But additionally, of course, they are setting generations off against each other, because if you're young, and they're driving this fake demand for the vaccine, because of course, if you're young, you want to do more things. You want to go to the pubs, you want to go to restaurants, you want to go to cinemas.
And those nasty old people are stopping us.
Well, exactly, because they've been vaccinated and we haven't. We don't get to go because we can't prove our immunity. Well, are you immune anyway? We'll come on to that in a minute. But then let's have a look at this, because of course the care homes, the first group to be starting tomorrow to be vaccinated. And this letter has been going out. Thank you very much to the person who sent this to me. Dear colleague, COVID-19 vaccinations and care homes program launch. So it describes the program launch. Now here's a key part of it here. In preparation, care home managers should put together staff lists, including basic details, name, gender, date of birth, NHS number, GP details for each staff member. Be ready to provide each staff member with a letter confirming their employment in the care sector, keep staff records of vaccinations and report via the capacity tracker. Now, last week, if you remember, we were talking about the training course that's being given to vaccine volunteers, the people that the NHS is going to ask to volunteer to administer vaccines that are effectively untrained, other than having gone through an online course. And if you remember, there was a big section on that on consent. And of course, if we look at what the government's saying with respect to the idea of immunity passports, they're very much suggesting that, well, it's not mandatory for you to take this vaccine, but there might be, a problem with
a variety of things,
corporate requirements for you to follow terms and conditions, which might say that you've had to have the vaccine. But if you look at this, there is no doubt in my mind that staff are going to be effectively bullied into taking this. It's going to be mandatory. It's going to be a requirement that staff have had this.
Yeah, and there's nothing about informed consent, which of course is the NHS's policy, that if you're going to receive treatment, you should know the benefits and you should also know the dangers and the side effects of what you're getting. That now is not mentioned in any of the NHS documentation.
So yesterday on the Andrew Marr show, June Rain, who's the CEO of the MHRA, said it's vitally important that everyone eligible has the vaccination to help defeat this terrible disease, is what she said. Okay, if you can take that as you like. But let's see what they have been up to and the British government has been up to, because, of course, what happened next? Before we get to that, let's ask this question. Brian, what danger does any unvaccinated individual pose to the vaccinated?
Well, judging by the infection rates, almost none.
Well, it depends, doesn't it, on whether the vaccine actually provides any level of immunity. Now, the mainstream press today absolutely trying to persuade people that you might get 3 months immunity or you might get 6 months immunity. But in fact, we know that the result from these vaccines isn't immunity at all. It's a sort of suppression of symptoms. So the question then is, what is the benefit for the government of rolling this out in this way? Well, if we've been paying attention to the narratives that have been going through the mainstream press in the last couple of months, the idea of an asymptomatic spreader has been pushed around. We've got to be fearful of asymptomatic spreaders. And so there is a narrative building here that the unvaccinated could still infect those who have had the vaccination, and that because they've had the vaccination, which suppresses the symptoms, that those people then become asymptomatic spreaders, and therefore we need to continue with lockdown and so on. So this is slowly building up to become a gift that keeps on giving for the government, in a sense.
Yeah, because the whole thing is based on a full premise. So they have got to continue to lie and manipulate the data in order to keep this thing going to their entire satisfaction.
Yes.
And we know from the medical scientists who are speaking to us directly that what the government is stating about the efficacy of the vaccines is not true.
That is correct. So where does that take us?
Well, I tweeted this out in the last few days. It was kindly sent through to me, but it was a copy of the package leaflet that went with the Pfizer vaccine. And what I found interesting was that on the document, you can find this quite easily online if you search for it, COVID-19 mRNA vaccine BNT162b2 concentrate for solution for injection. You can find the document. It's not very long. It does report side effects. But I was just fascinated that when you read down through the paragraph on reporting side effects, it said as the final sentence there, by reporting side effects, you can help provide more information on the safety of the vaccine. So what you're actually getting there is that we've got a drug manufacturer who is saying my product's safe. It then puts out a leaflet clearly showing that in all circumstances it's not safe, from some pretty unpleasant mild side effects to clearly worse side effects and side effects that are not declared. But if you should be unlucky enough to get these side effects, well, do tell us, because then you can help us make more profits from our defective medication. The cynicism is unbelievable.
Well, yeah, but it's worse than that, isn't it? Because what they're effectively doing there is acknowledging that they're using the general population or the specific groups that are on that list that we just showed you in the order. They're using those as the test, the lab rats.
As the lab rats. Alex, are we being unkind here, or are we seeing it as it is?
You would always be accused by some of being unkind, but then the basis on which people say that is often a knee-jerk. Oh, come. The British establishment wouldn't be like this. You know, the final split between me and some of my old GCHQ buddies who tolerated a bit of dissidence on my part about Russia policy was when I said that the entire pool of the social work profession and the entire pool of some parts of the medical establishment had been tainted. And this was a classic case of, oh, come, come, don't frighten the horses. Your job as a more informed man, or as a man who's had a government role, is to keep everyone on board, rowing together. So that's the basis on which we get accused of this kind of thing. But, Brian, this isn't the first time that vulnerable groups in the population, just in Britain, just in the home counties area of England, have been tested this way. I mean, you never tire of recommending that people look up Teresa Cooper's book, which has been published as an audiobook as well, both as under the title Trust No One and under the title Pin Down. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but the entire vector of that autobiography is that these young ladies in a Church of England run home are visited once a week by an unscrupulous GP in hoc to a pharmaceutical who's getting a handsome sum per head to try out antidepressant medication and other pharmaceutical products on these captive minors before they are given license for the general population.
Well, that's absolutely correct. And of course, the girls in that church institution were being drugged unconscious for days and abused alongside those tests. So if people have not come across that particular book, I'd recommend that you read it for a real insight into what goes on in the United Kingdom.
Now, Brian mentioned immunity from prosecution for vaccine companies last week, but the specific announcement was made on Thursday with respect to Pfizer. So here's Jurist. UK government grants Pfizer civil legal liability for COVID-19 vaccines. And they're saying the UK government announced Thursday that it had granted Pfizer legal immunity, protecting American pharmaceutical company from civil lawsuits due to any unforeseen complications arising from the problems with its COVID-19 vaccine. Now, of course, they can't really be unforeseen in the sense that there hasn't been proper testing going on in the first place. It says the special legal indemnity was the result of an emergency government consultation in September, when the UK Department of Health and Social Care determined that changes to civil liability were necessary to better facilitate the widespread use of a COVID-19 vaccine in Britain. So there's been a statutory instrument laid, Regulation 3, which implements Regulation 345 of this legislation, the Human Medicines Regulations 2012. So let's just look at what Section 345 says. Because last week, Brian said, well, of course, it might provide immunity for the companies, but there's always the individuals. Well, in fact, there aren't, because what this is saying is that none of the following are to be subject to any civil liability for any loss or damage resulting from the use of the product in accordance with the recommendation or requirement. A, any holder of an authorization for the product. B, any manufacturer for the product. C, any officer, servant, employee, or agent of a person within paragraphs A or B. Or D, any healthcare professional. So that really rules out anybody that could possibly be linked to the delivery of these vaccines or for the vaccines themselves. So there's complete immunity there. Well, it didn't end there because, of course, also on Saturday, or Friday, the vaccine. The COVID-19 vaccines have been added to the vaccine damage payments scheme as well. So that apparently allows for a payment of up to £120,000 for individuals that have been disabled in the rare case that a vaccine produces highly damaging side effects to patients. Now, I've got to ask a question, Brian. What possible use could £120,000 be to somebody that had some kind of life-changing injury as a result of receiving a vaccination?
Absolutely correct. And if people go and investigate that compensation scheme that the government runs, you will find case after case where it took people years and years and years in order to get any compensation out, and by the time they got the compensation out, the lives had already been ruined over that period. And of course, as you're saying, the money was insignificant to have any real effect on the future life. So the government creates the pot to give the illusion that there's some form of compensation scheme. Why should it do it? Because it's telling us the vaccines are safe. Well, of course, the reality is the vaccines we can see over history have not been safe, But when people have come to that government pot to take the money, they've been delayed, stalled, obfuscated for years, and then given a sum which is utterly derisory for the scale of the damage that's befallen them. And let's remember that people have died as a result of vaccines, so that's the end of another life. I mean, this is appalling what's going on, Mike.
Well, okay, so, but the news gets even better, because UNICEF is going to ship 2 billion COVID-19 vaccines to developing nations next year, because all the governments have agreed that nobody should be left out of this. So 2 billion doses. UNICEF is working with 350 airlines and freight companies to deliver vaccines and 1 billion syringes to countries such as Burundi, Afghanistan and Yemen. At the recent G20 summit, leaders of the world's biggest economies pledged to ensure equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, so everybody has to get it. COVAX is the organization, co-led by Gavi, the World Health Organization, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, are going to discourage governments from hoarding COVID-19 vaccines and to focus on first vaccinating the most at risk in every country. So that's good news. Well, of course, earlier we had this lady on, June Rain from the MHRA. And if you remember back to last week's programme, of course, the government saying that they were extremely proud at the independence of this organisation, that the approval of the Pfizer vaccine in the UK was done independently, no vested interest in that decision whatsoever. Well, let's just go back a period of time here to this press release. The MHRA awarded $1.3 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that turned into £980,000 for a partnership to improve safety monitoring of medicines in low and middle income countries. So you know, the MHRA taking money from somebody who absolutely has a vested interest, and that in turn creates a massive conflict of interest, does it not? Aside from the other conflict of interest that we highlighted last week with respect to connections to AstraZeneca and GlaxoSmithKline and others.
Yeah, so MHRA is not fit for purpose, and it's simply a bought organisation that in fact is working on behalf of the people pushing the vaccines out. They should be challenged directly. I would encourage our audience to look at the facts around this and then go to challenge the individuals within MHRA directly as to what their independence really is.
Now, Alex, try not to laugh when I put this one on screen. This is Dan Hodges from the Mail on Sunday yesterday. His headline: How Vladimir Putin's anti-vaxxers are trying to use COVID to kill us as surely as his agents did in Salisbury. He said, we've been tracking the anti-vaxxers propaganda, and a lot of it is linked to his bot farm in St. Petersburg, a minister told me. So this is Dan Hodges taking some information from the government, from a government minister, giving it no real sort of criticism or comment, just taking it and printing it. And that government minister went on to say, part of it is trying to sow the usual disinformation and chaos, and part is due to the fact he's worried about Russia being seen to lag behind on producing its own vaccine. Well, that's a complete load of nonsense, because Russia has already rolled out its vaccine. It's been vaccinating quietly. It hasn't made a big deal about it. I think the Foreign Ministry and the embassy finally made some comment about it after Britain had made such a fanfare of theirs. And then Dan Hodges goes on to say there's plenty of evidence Putin began leveraging the anti-vaxxer movement as part of his destabilization operation long before the appearance of COVID. In 2018, a report by the American Johns Hopkins University revealed how Russia had identified vaccinations as a wedge issue. He goes on to talk about Russia's involvement in the United States election process. He says that GCHQ was tasked with defending the Oxford vaccine from a Russian misinformation campaign. And last week, the army mobilized its shadowy 77th Brigade, which specializes in counter-adversarial information activity, with the mission to specifically counter anti-COVID vaccine cyber activity from Russian and Chinese operatives. So the claim is that this is being pushed, 77 Brigade's efforts are being pushed outside the borders. This is not true. Of course, they're operating inside the borders on people that are perceived by others, by the establishment, to be linked to Russian propaganda. Maybe they've appeared on RT or something like that, for example. So, Alex, I don't really know where to start with this, because they keep running out the same old tropes and rhetoric, and it didn't work at any point in the recent past. Why on earth would the likes of Dan Hodges think that he can make this fly at this stage?
My challenge to Dan Hodges, whose Telegraph blogs I used to read with quite some respect for their honesty on British politics, is this, or indeed anyone else who's using the term disinformation, Carol Cadwallader or anyone else, regardless of any political spectrum they come from. Can you define the difference between misinformation and disinformation? After all, misinformation is a very well long-established English word. It's morally neutral. Well, I won't give too much of the answer away. I'm interested in eliciting a definition from others. Disinformation is a specific Soviet term, and I haven't seen any clear definitions of terms yet. Therefore, disinformation is an emotional label until proved otherwise, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know that it's a sub-editor who writes the headlines and not Mr. Hodges himself, but I'm struck by this phrase, Vladimir Putin's anti-vaxxers. Clearly, the second element in that phrase, the noun anti-vaxxers, is people in Britain who are sceptical about this specific claimed new vaccine remedy. Right? It's not actually talking about people who refuse all inoculations on principle. So there's a muddying of the waters. But since it's clear that we're talking about British people writing in the English language as native speakers about their skepticism about a particular vaccine, to call them Vladimir Putin's anti-vaxxers is to really to use McCarthyism squared, McCarthyism in an order of magnitude greater upon them, and to say you are actually Russians. You're actually Russians. You're broadcasting Kremlin information. Now, that's an extremely serious accusation that's gone out under Mr. Hodges' line. Is he prepared to stand by the sub-editor's title there?
Well, I believe he is, because if you read down through the article, he's you know, the sub-editor's headline is not misrepresenting his position in any way, shape, or form, Alex.
So we should
have serious problems.
And we should be
then we have
challenging
serious
him.
problems.
Yeah, go ahead,
Brian.
Okay.
Well, we have serious problems there because Hodges, as far as I'm concerned, and I think it's his mother before him, got in a tangle with the Labour Party over the increasing application of a Blairite whip over the party. And he regarded himself as an early 2010s dissident in the medium of the time, which was Telegraph blogs. This was before UK Column got going. And now he seems to be turning tables on those who he would have previously associated himself with, free thinkers and first principles thinkers. But Brian, you wanted to add something?
We should just mention before Brian does that, of course, his mother was Glenda Jackson, Glenda Jackson, former Labour MP and obviously actress.
Yeah, well, all I wanted to say was that, of course, people need to be focusing on the journalists themselves. It's not enough to fight back against the Daily Mail or the Guardian or whatever paper the articles appear in. It's the journalists themselves that needs to be held to account. We'll get a much better response from this. In a minute, I'll be looking at a Guardian report, but it's the same thing at work.
Now, earlier, Brian made a comment about the fact that families cannot sort of look after their elderly relatives in care homes. And somebody sent me a video clip this morning and really is making the point very strongly that video clips like the one we're about to show you need to be used to challenge MPs and start getting some action on what's going on in care homes in this country at the moment. So just have a look at this and then we can discuss it afterwards.
Well, right. Well, can I tell you, for the record, that her colour is very poor. You know, she's quite blue around the lips, and her breathing is quite fast, and that's, to me, that is a cause for concern.
Well, like I say, we've not had any concerns with the.
Well, I know, but you never do have concerns for her. Do you know, with respect, you don't. You know, I understand you're doing your best, but you know, I can see that my mother is not well just by looking at her through the window.
Well, all I can suggest is that you ring up on Monday Monday morning.
Well, what do you mean I ring up on Monday morning? That's 2 whole days away.
Well, like I say, I'm not the manager. So
You're not the manager, but I mean, hang on a minute, just a minute before you go. I am asking you. I want this document. Hang on a minute. Don't take her away. Hey, don't take her away. Don't take her away. Don't take her away. You bastards. You absolute bastards. Oh, God.
Well, Mike, a tragic piece of film. I mentioned it last week that I can personally vouch that this is going on with 2 particular elderly relatives who we now cannot have any easy contact with because effectively the government has started to introduce laws which are not proper laws. They're being interpreted and misinterpreted by the residential homes and the care homes, but of course they turn the lock or draw the bolt on the door, and the family is then prevented from being able to interact properly with their elderly relatives. So this lady getting very emotional and swearing at the end of the clip, I don't blame her at all. She's letting off steam, but she would have gone away in utter desperation at watching essentially strangers keeping her mother in a prison environment. And this is happening to tens and tens of thousands of elderly people across the country. And we know that many of those tens and tens of thousands of elderly people were killed off by the current government as a result of their, I'm going to call it woefully inadequate, but I think it was a deliberately planned event to infect those elderly people with COVID. So, Alex, we are watching a complete and utter breakdown of constitutional principles in this country. We've got a dictatorship which is now simply saying, we're going to stop you showing love and compassion to members of your family.
That is the prima facie evidence of these clips, and I think what's holding some people back from enunciating that conclusion, that there are such things as complete and utter bastards in the National Health Service and in private health care, is this idea that certain professions are beyond criticism. Again, it's another version of the block I encountered, well, not so much internally, but after leaving GCHQ from former colleagues who were saying you shouldn't go that far. You shouldn't impugn certain professions, the police, social work, the party policies, or, as represented in Parliament, because these people are there for us. We must all be on the same page. You need to get past this attitude, I'm afraid, and Britain is particularly prone to it because we've been blessed with a history remarkably free of tyranny. You only need to cross the English Channel, and the countries that are even the most like Britain, all of a sudden, as soon as you land in a country like the Netherlands, and certainly if you go further away from it, the assumption is people who are not related to me by blood are very likely to want to trick me and to take my resources off me. And that doesn't magically stop when you put on a carer's suit.
Yes. And to be fair to the carers, of course, the carers now live a particularly unpleasant world because they've got a huge amount of pressure put on them by their employers who are telling them what they must and must not do. And they're caught in the trap as well. They're going to be force vaccinated themselves. So,
well, I'm just going to say, nonetheless, there was a certain amount of callousness there, which I think, no matter how much pressure you're under, you can't allow your humanity to disappear all of a sudden.
You can't, and I'm absolutely accepting what you say, Mike. But of course, we know that staff in these care homes are particularly being told, for example, you must not tolerate any bad manners or abusive behaviour. And so the moment that lady was showing real human passion and getting passionate because her mother's being taken away, the care assistant will interpret that as abusive behaviour because she's been programmed to believe that. So we're moving on to the subject of how people's minds have been manipulated to create this system. Just take a break from that at the moment. Contrast what was happening in that care home with Nigel Farage, who a couple of days ago posted this video.
So a big decision was made. The schools were to reopen, but hospitality was to pay the price. It has been a catastrophic year for pubs, wine bars, in fact anybody involved in the hospitality trade. Now from tomorrow, some pubs in the country are reopening, others in Tier 3, life for them is pretty much impossible. In Wales, that maniac Drakeford, who's the First Minister, has now banned alcohol in pubs, something that Cromwell didn't even manage to achieve. But what I've come to have a look at today.
So there we have it. Whilst all the things are going on in the country at the moment, we have not come out of the European Union. Brexit has not been completed, but we've got people being brutalised by the police on the streets. We've got elderly people being brutalised and killed off in nursing and care homes. And Nigel Farage steps forward and says that the most important issue is that we should be supporting the pubs in this country. Now, I personally found this very offensive. You said to me, Mike, well, of course, we need to support the pubs. And I understand that remark. Why do we need to support the pubs? Because, of course, it's inside the pubs that people will talk about what is really happening in the country. And that is one of the key reasons why the government has made sure that pubs have been shutting down permanently in their thousands, but also people aren't going to be allowed to go to social venues where they will talk and exchange information about what's going on. But I'm going to say, is this the best thing that Nigel Farage can focus on at the moment when the UK column can show so easily what the really serious matters are? Alex, I've stayed on the tail of Nigel Farage for a great many years. At one stage, we had 17.4 million people in this country clearly awake to the scam of the European Union and Brexit. And that fire, that passion, which should now be applying itself to the regulation of the Conservative government, effectively neutralised by Nigel Farage, who's more interested in where he can get his next point from.
This is, what, the third political party that Mr. Farage has wished to lead? I know he didn't found UKIP, that's Dr. Alan Sked who founded it. But then Mr. Farage founded the Brexit Party, and now he's founding a Reform Party. Okay, we'll cut some slack to someone who defects from one party to another or becomes an independent out of reasons of conscience, or from an independent starts collaborating with a party, particularly at a local council seat level for pragmatic reasons. But to hop to three parties in succession, there's not really that much substance to the man, is there? Now, he's no fool. He understands his history. You can't say that he's hostile to the traditional British view of liberty, but he will not actually enunciate in terms what he thinks are the core inalienable rights of freeborn Englishmen, or however he would like to express it. That there's not much actual backbone to his platform. Ultimately, it's a sense of live and let live, but that's no good when you're up against a savage beast. You need to be able to defend certain core principles, such as we're now doing in our constitutional podcast series, A Dissident's Guide to the Constitution. We're not claiming perfection. If anyone can do better, by all means. And understandably, in party politics, you don't have the time to make the points we would do in a broadcast or a podcast. But I do not see the fundamental red lines with Mr. Farage.
I certainly don't. And sorry, we've got an ad coming in here. My train of thought wants to move on, but we need to pop our ad in.
Yeah, look, we'll just briefly mention this. If you want to support the UK column because you like what we do, then please, that'd be very much appreciated. Head over to ukcolumn.org/community, and there are options to help us out there. And just before we move on, Alex, you mentioned The Dissident's Guide to the Constitution. Episode 4 of that is going up this afternoon. And we're looking at, well, our first look at democracy and what that means. You just want to mention something about that?
So we're questioning whether democracy is the absolute and ultimate British value. And next podcast, we'll be doing even more of that. So anyone who wishes to throw a hissy fit and say, I can't believe you guys are saying this, is welcome to discontinue listening to the series now. But the sad truth is that there are question marks over whether democracy is the apogee and what it means. Is it a stable situation? David Scott and I, during the podcast, come at it from fairly similar angles. I wouldn't say that you disagree with us, Mike, but you take a slightly different perspective on it, I think. But it's not a stable system. And if you promise people democracy for its own sake as the be-all and end-all, you don't end up with that. You end up inexorably with the theft of resources by majority vote and a slide into, well, I think David Scott would be prepared to call it socialism and death. I'm not quite as resolute in him in questioning it that's in that way. But the term democracy covers a multitude of sins. So we're going at it hammer and tongs. We're going with some fairly heavyweight, mainly Central European thinkers in the episode that will be going up shortly. And in a couple of weeks' time, we intend to round that off by going to perhaps the best 20th century British thinker who said, hang on about this democracy, and who looks at the party politics behind it. And that is Ben Green. So it'll be a bumpy ride, but if people have got with us this far, they'll be shortly prepared to go on to look at the historical development of the English and Scots and then British Constitution and understand it a little better than if we had just plunged in with the Anglo-Saxons straight off.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Well, just to reinforce the earlier comments about the male journalist, I was intrigued by this comment on social media. It was being pushed around by quite a few people. Watch the narrative shift. Frontline workers will not be the first to get the vaccine. This is because if they refuse, and they will, there will be no recovery from the PR gaffe. It then said 60% of nurses, 40% of doctors in NJ said they will not take the vaccine. Now, I'm assuming NJ is New Jersey, so I think the comment has come from overseas, but it was the Guardian article that had prompted what I thought was a very astute comment, that there's been a deliberate reason why the government suddenly backed off. This is the Guardian article. NHS staff will no longer be amongst the first people to be vaccinated against COVID-19 after a rethink about who should be given priority. And we've looked at those priorities. As I was trying to read the rest of this article, I did actually see it in the end, but of course up came the Guardian's firewall, so they're pleading poverty and need you to register and give them more details. But this was the journalist, and when you read the article, the one thing he doesn't do is any investigation into anyone in the NHS who might have concerns. So I decided to put some words in his mouth. I decided it was best to do no journalistic investigation into NHS staff concerns over the vaccine and just go for the easy option of promoting the government's and NHS pro-vaccine rhetoric. And that's exactly what he did in the article. No investigation into the fors and against whatsoever.
Now, the press and the media, of course, not doing their jobs in the most recent years, and people becoming aware of that, and so people aren't funding them properly, and they've been suffering commercially, and they haven't been getting the advertising revenue that they needed. And of course, we mentioned many times, going back to 2018, that the government decided to, what they describe as take action, to tackle the challenges the media faces today, that they launched the Cairncross Review. Dame Frances Cairncross will bring her experience in journalism to tackle the issues. This was Matt Hancock speaking in 2018. And he said that he trembled at the thought of a media regulated by the state in the time of malevolent political forces. Get this wrong, and I fear for the future of our liberal democracy. Well, the question is whether we should have one of those. But anyway, why am I bringing this up again? Because the EU has decided that actually in the EU it's the same deal. They need to get ready to help because of the digital decade that's coming, to help the press and media in the EU. And so what are they saying? They're saying that at the end of last week, the Commission adopted an action plan to support the recovery and transformation of the media and audiovisual sector. These sectors, particularly hit by the coronavirus crisis, are essential for democracy, Europe's cultural diversity and digital autonomy. The action plan focuses on 3 areas of activity, 10 concrete actions to help the media sector recover from the crisis by facilitating and broadening access to finance, transformed by stimulating investments to embrace the twin digital and green transitions while ensuring the sector's future resilience and empower the European citizens and companies. So it's being done under the auspices of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Here's that. 672.5 billion euros in total, Brian. 312.5 billion euros in grants, 360 billion euros in loans, and some of that money will be going to EU press and media in order to facilitate their future support of EU narratives. And Alex, you know, this is really a pretty incredible situation. We've talked about this on the Dissident's Guide, the effect of having, it's not a free media anymore because it is in the pay of government.
Need money, and I think you and I sometimes shrink back, at least I do, Mike, when people say, Alex Thomson, a journalist. That's a very heavy or high calling to claim to have if you're not doing it full time. And most of us, certainly the correspondents like the two Davids and myself, are doing it in our spare time and would perhaps prefer to call ourselves correspondents, even though I think David is a member of a journalists' organisation now. Journalism does require money and time for research, but then the question is, how are you funded? Just one data point on that is that Suzanne Moore spoke recently to, I think it was Lockdown TV, about this, because she's a classic socialist and second-generation feminist who found herself out on her ear from The Guardian after mildly questioning whether you could transgender, and then having being accused of upsetting and fear her colleagues and causing them to fear for their safety in the office. But the point there was, she went to see Catherine Viner, the editor, and said, isn't the Scott Trust behind me on this? Because that's the endowment fund that funds The Guardian, with increasing links to government through things like carrying public sector job adverts. And no, the Scott Trust said no, because the money interests there cut across those of journalism. So having huge amounts of endowment is not the solution. The only other model is subscriber-based. And that's why the UK column model is perhaps your only hope of free and fair information in this age, even if we're quite small by comparison. For another take on it, people should listen to, I think just uploaded overnight, The Dark Journalist on his channel on YouTube, talking to Catherine Austin Fitz. Towards the end of that, she says that it's the same with churches. Either you're funded locally by contributions from the pew, or you're funded, like an increasing number of churches that are surviving these days, by central endowments. And then they will pursue certain pro-government, pro-globalist agendas, inevitably. So Mr. Hancock and others saying that they'll, because it was Hancock at that time, wasn't it, and others since, saying we'll sling taxpayers' money at the press, shoring it up as a monopoly, is no guarantee that there will be good or accurate reporting, just that there will be lots of reporting.
Well, the amount of money that the EU is putting towards that, 650...
Well, no, not all of that is going to that particular purpose, but it's coming out of that fund. So my point is that there's no shortage of cash for this job.
No, and that's creating the Soviet as far as media is concerned. Well, let's interject with some pleasantry, because this has been a very tough news today. We'd like to say thank you very much to the people sending us cards and gifts. It happens at this time of year. It's a very nice thing. So this one we've got on screen was a very nice card, God's blessing to someone special at Christmas. And we say thank you for the card and the kind gift, which we believe has come all the way from North Carolina, USA. So welcome our US audience, and thank you for people who've been watching for some time. We're also going to say thank you very much for the kind gift which we've had from the Beach Hut Man. So that was unexpected and very well received. Yes. Okay. Well, we've got an eye on the clock. Have we got a couple of minutes?
Yes.
2 minutes. Okay. We'll just introduce the subject of the court case in Plymouth, which we've mentioned previously, about the renaming of a square. Now, the decision to rename the square, according to this gentleman, Danny Bamping, was taken on the back of Black Lives Matters protests, and therefore Plymouth City Council effectively caved in and decided they were going to get rid of the name Sir John Hawkins Square, because although he was a very prominent named person in the history of Plymouth and the Spanish Armada, he'd been involved in the slave trade, and so the council effectively said, we're going to change the name of the square and give it to Jack Leslie, a black footballer. And Danny Bamping took the council to court. This was what he argued, that the council had failed to comply with the law and its policies during the process. The decision was therefore racist. It failed to properly consider the history of Sir John Hawkins and was a knee-jerk reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement following the death in police custody of George Floyd in the United States in May. And Danny also argued that the square was the wrong place to honour the footballer, as there was a better alternative nearer Plymouth Argyle Stadium. Well, the judge rejected that. She rejected all of Mr. Bamping's arguments and said he'd failed to prove the council's decision was wrong. Under the law, I had to put significant weight on the opinion and decision taken by the council, and the judge found it had given proper consideration and reasons. Now, this is an interesting situation. I'm putting up the question, why should we be concerned? Well, the first reason we should be concerned is the court was not a court of record. It was a petty sessional civil court for administrative matters and not under civil procedure rules. And as such, there is no record now held of what the Plymouth City Council witnesses said. And the reason I raise that is because there is already challenge to the fact that the judge claims that witnesses said one thing when people present in the court said that is not true, but we have no record. And the second one here, that a court of no record is now setting the precedent for local authorities to rewrite history on the back of a violent political pressure group, Black Lives Matter, who are passing off this intersectionality, which we're encouraging people to buff up on, in intersectionality politics as a social science fact. And I have more on this, but with an eye on the time, we'll save that for Wednesday's news. Alex, we've got something very, very dangerous happening here when we have a pressure group that pops up out of nowhere with a lot of money to support it. It attacks our institutions and history. And the next minute we have local authorities saying, because of this aggressive pressure group, we must now change history. I look at this, I think of 1984, I also think of the Soviet system, and we're in the middle of it, and it's driving forward with remarkable speed.
I used to proudly tell people all over Eastern Europe that Britain had never renamed streets and squares and buildings, that this was something that Johnny Foreigner did, but those days are now behind us. Now, a district judge, of course, is a very low-ranking judge, and as you pointed out, the court that she presided over that day doesn't really merit the name of court in a classic common law sense. But this is what you get under the radar of civil procedure. The lower courts often will act on a kind of Napoleonic idea of balance of probabilities and heavily weighted towards philosophical argument. And sometimes judges in their summing up will make that explicit, as this district judge did, and say that the statute law directs me to believe public authorities. The burden or the presumption should be that I as a judge will believe what someone said if they are the state, is what it comes down to. If you get higher up into proper, less fiddled with courts, at least in the English-speaking countries, then they will dispense with that and say, prove everything that you've just claimed. That is the standard that's being lost. It goes all the way through to the international case on the continent now regarding coronavirus in some form, which has, I think, really faltered on this idea that the continental law of evidence is not there. So it has to be pursued in North America because only a common law court will actually require people to prove all their claims rather than say, trust us, we're the government. Now, we didn't have to used to have this, the other kind of court in Britain, but at a local level, at a low level, that's the kind of court that you now have. You just need to turn up and say, we're the government, and you've basically won the case. You're safe from perjuring yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. What an interesting situation that is. Last point on this is that Danny, of course, also said we need to be really aware of these types of courts, places of business, because this is the very court that is actually taking money from people in challenging council tax arrears. But we'll go into that in more detail another time. Alex, thank you very much for joining us.
We are going to do a short UK Column News Extra for any of our members that want to stay in the chat box, and we'll be back with you in about 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the support which has come in. It's really wonderful and a big boost to us after what's been a pretty tough year.
Apologies for the technical problems at the beginning.
We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.